Good afternoon, everybody. And for those on the East Coast, good morning. It's great to have everybody here today. Thanks for joining us on the 19th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium, hosted by the Acquisition Research Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. Really a great event. And we want to welcome you to panel number 2 today, which has its focus on innovating in acquisition in organizations, technologies, and applications. So I'm Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood. I'm the director for the Army Hypersonics, Directed Energy, Space, and Rapid Acquisition programs. And I'll be the panel for today's, or the chair for today's panel. So it's a great honor to do that. And we have some really super great members of our panel, and I'll introduce them in the sequence which they'll speak to us today. So first we have Ms. Jennifer Taylor from the Institute of Defense Analysis. She did some really fantastic work. Mr. Finkenstadt from the Naval Postgraduate School, alumni there. And then Ms. Carly Jackson from the Naval Information and Warfare Center. And then Mr. Brian Hudgens from the Naval Postgraduate School. And so we're really honored to have these great research and great ideas to be presented to the panel today. To start off the conversation today, let me just open with a couple of remarks, and then we'll go right to the panelists. Each panelist will have about 12 to 15 minutes to present theirs. And then once they're all complete, then we'll open it up for the Q&A, and you have the Q&A box in the process there to open up for Q&A at the end of all the presentations. What you hear today from our panelists is innovating in acquisition, and how do we change, modify, adjust other behaviors that we have as we're executing the things that our national command authorities asked us to do. And this subject is incredibly important to me in my role, where we in the Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office have been asked to behave a little bit differently in support of the Army's modernization strategy. And so we're doing things a little bit differently than what has traditionally been done, so that we can move quickly and provide capability quickly to and a credible response to our adversaries' activities. Our job in our organization is to provide prototypes with residual combat capability, overcoming what we traditionally call the valley of death on the technical side. And so we work on an accelerated timeline, and in so doing, we'll provide our adversary multiple dilemmas as we move forward into capability for our warfighters. A lot of times that we get asked the question, how do we do that? And there are a couple of things that we've learned over the years that are very important in accelerating acquisition. One of them is we've established an Army Board of Directors. So that is for us, both the headquarters of the Department of Army Secretariat side and the Army staff side. So linking those two together with the Secretary of the Army, the Undersecretary, the Army Acquisition Executive, and then the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Army Futures Command. And that's my board of directors, the group that I report to and who assigns my mission sets. So I have a very short chain of command for decisions, and that group decides my missions and the priorities that we execute as an organization. So a simple thing like an organizational construct can help change the behavior and how we do things, and how we accept risk, and how we put that risk into practice, and how we tailor the programs accordingly for the risk that we're willing to accept. And so we're constantly looking for ways to speed that up. So with that brief introduction, now what I'd like to do is kick off the panel discussions. Again, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose any questions for the panelists. And then again, after everybody has done their presentations, we'll open it up for a conversation. So with that, Ms. Taylor, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me just get the screen share going here. Hopefully you guys can see that well enough. Thank you all so much for having me today. I know I even have a little bit of a challenge choosing to be on my own panel with Emily Murphy and Moshe Schwartz on our complimentary one. So I enjoy hearing what they have to say as well. So in some ways, I'm a visitor to the innovation world and the innovation ecosystem, which I'm using as shorthand particularly for the variety of defense organizations that support research and tech development and integration. I don't spend a significant amount of time paying too much attention to cutting edge tech. What actually captures most of my attention is organizations and how organizations can work better. How do we make our institutions more effective at their missions by considering people, processes, and tools that they have available? So that's how it all integrates together. I say this to admit a little bit of a bias towards the institution, but I want to note a willingness to improve that system by improving strategy, policy, and process. All of it can happen simultaneously. Since working on the Section 809 panel, I've noticed another kind of gravitational pull in our system towards that of tech and innovation organizations, towards speed and fast fielding, and again, all of that new technology. So as we're seeing this sort of pool between bureaucracy and institutions, we seem to be bringing together organizations that don't really have a translation key between operational philosophies. The Department of Defense is obviously a performance-based bureaucracy that focuses on time, schedule, and budget. And for a great deal of time, that's been what's been important. So DoD is driven to perform its national security mission and to maximize those results to make every process and activity as predictable as possible. But the innovation organizations want to move faster with significant autonomy and more freedom to fail. So you can see I'm teeing up these inherent bifurcations in modes of operations. I just got back from New Orleans, and I will say my favorite metaphor for this is that these are brackish, muddy, and muddy waters that are very hard to see through, with lots of potential ways that we might be able to get it done better. And that's part of a reason why we see an uptick in recent years in startups and innovation organizations. I reordered these slightly, my slides slightly from the posted version to make this point. In the last decade, we see a kind of a surge of these innovation organizations and problem-solving groups that create a big challenge for us. So how might the DoD best corral these groups, integrate their contributions, align their efforts, and maximize their effects? This slide isn't, of course, meant to be comprehensive, in part because we're only starting to map the entirety of the system, and kudos to the department's efforts in order to do so right now. But I want to acknowledge the number of these innovation organizations that have just been created in the last decade. And that in of its sense, because there's been 1,000 flowers blooming, has left many of our promising industry representatives without a centralized door to knock on. So again, and partly within this slide, I want to nod to what DoD has been doing with their new portal to help address that challenge. And I've included the website down below. So hopefully this gives you some sense of what DoD has had to accommodate and adapt for without having the culture, the mandates, the processes for some of these new requirements to really be accommodated within the larger system. So if innovation organizations need freedom to fail, how is CAPE set up to provide performance oversight? And if the budget needs to move to help tech get across that valley of death, is Congress willing to allow that flexibility? And that's sort of the nature in which I've been thinking about these questions. A good example is when the SCO was founded in 2012, it wasn't public and its working weren't public, and it had significant sponsorship from DepSec Def Carter. So there was protection from some of these concerns, and they were allowed to sort of take root without dealing with some of the bureaucratic issues that take place. The future organizations came on board with a little bit more fanfare. So they needed to succeed almost straight out of the gate. And so I believe, though, that this causes a little bit of a push against the bureaucracy that we need to kind of address in order to move forward and determine ways to align and integrate with that. So that led me to ask the research question of hearing about these challenges faced by innovation organizations. How do we actually support the requirements of both the bureaucracy and the innovation organizations by considering which attributes, I'm calling them bureaucratic environment attributes and innovation environment attributes, are worth thinking about. And these attributes describe the elements that need to be considered to support decision-making, realigning the innovation ecosystem, aligning efforts, potentially developing new strategies for innovation. So what do I mean when I speak of innovation and innovation organizations? I chose to leverage a definition of innovation that was proposed by some of my IDA colleagues in a recent DAU article that was published. And I use this definition in part because it expands beyond technology and considers practices and concepts and innovative ways of doing things, which helps, I think, to integrate into the bureaucracy. So it could be new concepts of operations that are innovative, new processes and new ideas. So the innovation steering group that was just founded by the Department of Defense is looking at how to map the ecosystem, how to bring a bit more cohesion to these multiple entities working on this issue. And their definition from their broad approach was quite broad. And they said, if you think you're innovative, we want to know about it. And we want to know what you're doing to innovate. So I'm curious to see how that unfolds in the coming years and months. In order to answer that question, I reviewed organizational and innovation literature, interviewed over 25 leaders in the defense field, looking at innovation organizations, and attended a number of events like this where these kinds of topics are discussed in order to help formulate my own thinking on what attributes are important. But I came away with the thought that we are looking to optimize for only some aspects of the system and would benefit from a more holistic approach. The attributes framework I propose is intended to start a discussion. It's not intended to be comprehensive, but it's hopefully gives people enough things to think about. And I look forward to hearing where I get it wrong, where I get it right, and what you guys might want to see included in future iterations of it in order to help us answer these questions. So there are some obvious and fundamental differences between the innovation organizations and the bureaucracy. To be honest, sometimes the risk tolerances are misaligned. DoD is not necessarily known for being able to make fast and agile changes. But in some sense, what I want to point out as well is that while the bureaucracy is set up in order to minimize that risk, and that's also important. It's not an opportunity in terms of involving and bringing on more innovation organizations and creating these structures. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to keep working on what is the appropriate model for the appropriate time for the appropriate requirement. So I want to just propose and allow you guys to see a little bit of this tension that exists between the two. And I think it's something that we all sort of feel acutely. So mixing these cultures and different ways of doing business is obviously incredibly difficult. In applying this framework that I'll propose on this last slide, it may help us prioritize certain attributes for decision-making around alignment and innovation, and consider different considerations yield different results. And depending on the most important attributes that are important to a given structure at a given time. So I want to say there are necessary ways to accommodate the changes within the bureaucracy that needs to take place. Also, when we think about innovation organizations, they want a little bit more freedom to operate. And how I see that manifesting is if we can clear away some of the functions that can be centralized, that might be hiring, budgeting, administration questions, acquisition management, contracts approvals, that sort of thing. We can regularize those processes in a way that makes sense for the innovation organizations and develop them in a new way. That might help to actually free up the mental creative space that these innovation organizations could benefit from. And so this framework might help to assist in building a case to measure that innovation differently from the rest of the department, give those centralized functions a little bit more of a different flavor, allow us to see what performance looks like in these particular cases, and that might help us build a new culture of innovation across the department. So sort of suggesting if we can figure out a way to separate and make sure that we're including a lot of the centralized so that we can create freedom for the organizations that would need it. So these are the attributes themselves. I'll just run down quite quickly. Independence, which is the degree to which the organization is responsible for its own budgeting. Autonomy, the freedom of action to be able to translate one's own preferences and drive their own strategy. The approximate time to stand up or full operational capability, if it happens to go by that kind of lexicon. Proximity to customers, by which I mean, are they closely aligned to the combatant commands and services or OSD? How closely are we working with our customers on a day-to-day basis? Our ability to deliver capabilities from the bureaucratic side is looking at the contracting authority, how fast are we able to do rapid acquisition? And personnel, taking a look at the mechanics, actually having the authorities necessary to bring people on board. On the innovation side, we look at removal of boundaries. How flexible are the structures so that rotational opportunities might be able to facilitate some of that creativity of thinking, new connections of ideas, applying things in new and different ways. What are the entrepreneur leadership qualities that are available to anyone that might be leading an organization? And then the ability to disrupt is finding those opportunities to do things differently. Access to technology is making sure that there's free flowing information between the technology centers and the industry and our innovation organizations. And then people and intellectual capital, meaning not the ways in which we hire, but the people which we hire, which are those folks who are more able to accommodate innovative thinking or connect these new ideas to each other, think about these topics in a new and different ways. So the DoD bureaucratic environment attributes are driven by placement within the organization, within the enterprise, and the world in which the organization exists, and then the innovative environment attributes are those that are critical for innovation organizations. So while there might be some significant overlap, I see them as must-haves related to the innovation organizations. So I want to just draw your attention to the bottom three, which are flip sides of the same coin. They're very closely aligned. And then I will quickly wrap up and say I welcome any thoughts, as I said, related to what might be missing, what could help to continue the discussion on this and help answer any questions about how we might resolve these kinds of tensions that exist when we merge these kinds of cultures. So thank you all for the opportunity. I really appreciate the chance to be here today.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ms. Taylor. Super interesting as we look at our organizational structures and how we behave. So thanks for doing that. There are already some questions popping up in the question box, so maybe take a look at some of those as we get ready for the end. We'll next turn this over to our next speaker, which is Dan. Dan, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, sir. Good morning, everybody. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Figginstadt. I'm an assistant professor here at Naval Postgraduate School. I'm going to talk to you today about a topic that kind of landed in our lap. Hopefully everybody can see the slides. Landed in our lap from observing a teenage boy play a video game in my house. So it was actually my son. And he was playing a video game related to like killing zombies, but you had to like manage resources and logistically prepare for like these waves of zombies over a time horizon. And we started talking about some pretty typically boring topics that he found very engaging and exciting, like how to, sort of allocate his resources and plan for future disruptions and stuff. And as someone who studies procurement and supply chain, I was like, this is super interesting because I don't talk to him about that kind of stuff very often. And it was the gaming aspect of it that made it interesting. And so I thought to myself, well, contracting and acquisition can be pretty boring, and so can most of our topics, especially in the education and training environment. So what if we could gamify some of that? And what do we mean by gamification? We mean basically placing game elements on non-gaming situations, right? So, we do have rules, but we don't have that freedom to act always. And it's interesting to listen to Jennifer's presentation because she's basically talking about constraints and opportunities and how you provide relief or reinforcement for either of those, right? Relieve the constraints and reinforce the opportunities. So that's what we think we can see with gamification. I've been lucky enough to work with Erik Helzer here at the Naval Postgraduate School on this as a co-principal investigator on a lab that we've stood up, which is called the Simulation and Ideation Lab for Applied Science, which was stood up and named after my son that we sort of took on this project with. And we've taken this and imagined a whole host of opportunities. And hopefully Michelle Johnson, who's on co-hosting, can send the link to one of the videos of our video games. The overall team, so we have worked with, starting with ARP and then moving into AIRC, DLI, the language school here, DAU, MITRE, NC State, Air University, and Michigan Innovatrium. We've all worked in different ways on collaborating, on learning from each other, on gamified education and training. Our principal team that we're working with on the AIRC effort is NC State. And so you can see this started with some MBA students here. They're at the top of the list working on this research, who published their thesis this past January and is available to read. It is very interesting. I encourage you to read it. Along with Erik, who I just mentioned, and Perry, who's in the computer science department here at NPS. We've teamed with Rob Hanfield, who's a thought leader in supply chain and procurement, and his computer science team, Arnav Jala and Derek Martin there at NC State. And so we've been able to do some really cool stuff over the course of a year. And this is just kind of going into the overarching, what we've learned from that, and then maybe some specifics on specific research that we've done. So what's the main problem or challenge that we're trying to get at? And it's funny, Erik and I actually wrestled with, like, how are we going to like frame this so that people can understand why gaming could be useful in this environment? And we thought about defense acquisition specialists. That's what we mean by DA specialists. And what is the life like in their world? You know, what do they deal with in that environment? And it's a high risk, tightly regulated, zero defect environment, right? And high public scrutiny. So the organizational science will tell you that leads to this performance orientation versus learning orientation, which is I need to figure out how to get the right answer, to get the A and not be wrong, and doesn't encourage, like, I want to play in the sandbox for a little bit and ask what if. Consequently, our lab, that's the motto, what if, right? And so it presents this paradox of how do we promote that deep, effective, lifelong learning in a professional field where the conditions supportive to the learning would be risky in a traditional mission environment. And so that's where we think gaming and simulation can really play a part. Why are they ideal for defense acquisition specifically? And this is where we talk about that reduction versus reinforcement, right? So there's these features of gamified learning, and then features of a defense acquisition and operating environment, right? And so the ability to inject fantasy can reduce sort of the objective realities and litigious consequences that we see in the acquisition environment. But challenges and goals, which are typical to a game, also reinforce sort of these complex problems and professional achievement elements of a defense acquisition environment. We want some level of representation because we have highly variable environments, and sort of being able to capture that for the user and the player and the student is really important for their ability to action that in the real world. Curiosity and mystery gets along the idea of, like, we want our customer or our participants in defense acquisition to become explorers. We want them to look into the market and to ask critical thinking questions. Feedback is also important. Communication matters a lot in this field. Rules, I don't think I have to explain that to the crowd, right? Like, rules have to exist for games. Rules definitely exist in defense acquisition. And then the bottom is where it's really interesting, right? So voluntary participation and mulligans. So all of our decisions have consequences in a defense acquisition environment. And we usually are constrained to our one role, right? We're contracting, program management, finance, legal, engineering, whatever. But games allow us to actually empathize and pretend and try to be other people, right? And we also get this idea of mulligans, which is, as we do that and we explore and we play around and we screw up, yeah, we just reset and we try again, right? But we get some feedback also that tells us that, like, doing that might lead to a bad outcome. So what did we learn over the course of our research in terms of the types of game studies that we do, and then this research lines of effort? Okay, so let's start with types of game studies. That's your figure to the right. We see engagement gaming, exposure gaming, and sort of what they call the serious gaming or simulation world. In engagement gaming, that's what we did here with our research projects. Some students here actually developed a first-person shooter game to teach contracting, and you guys can watch the video where you have to, like, disarm a bomb after you fight through some people, and the right wire is associated with the right answer to the question, right? Does that really get at higher level critical thinking learning? No, it doesn't. But we were teaching like FAR Part 8 in the OMB category management memo, right? So these are things you got to learn. They're not exciting. Sorry for those people who wrote them. They're not exciting. And so we're trying to make it something that a student would want to play in and spend some time in, and we just sort of pick up as a natural offshoot of that. Exposure gaming is sort of like, well, we're not going to build the game ourselves. We're going to look for corollary games that have certain aspects that, you know, say a game that involves logistical resource management, and we're going to have logisticians play that and see if it has an impact on them working through real case studies or real world work. And then serious games and simulations are what you would imagine, which is where we try to recreate real events within a gaming world with certain rules and certain feedback mechanisms that really represent that. And how we do that here at Silas and NPS is it involves 3 lines of effort, which are developing curriculum and learning objectives, actually designing a game and designing a research study to measure the efficacy of that effort, right? So we're sort of walking, chewing gum, and skipping rope all at the same time. So it's an interesting thing that we picked up on, but it's worth noting because as we talk to stakeholders in the DoD space working on games for different areas of learning, most of them are only doing 1 or 2 of these. Almost no one's doing all 3. We are not trying to be the end-all be-all for game design because we leave that to the commercial space, but we do think we have a lot to add in terms of curriculum design, research study design, and how we merge that with the game design. Some initial research outcomes. So we were able to conduct 5 waves of between group studies where we split the group down the middle. They played our video game. Randomly, half the class would play the video game to learn a FAR Part 8 lesson or an OMB category management lesson, or the other half would sit through traditional PowerPoint learning. As you see, we have results typical to what you'd see in other gaming research, which is our players play and achieve a median improvement score over a pre and post test that are very similar to just taking the traditional lesson. However, they tend to enjoy it more and state that they'd be willing to play it outside of normal class and continue to learn from it. Now, something to note for this is for our first 4 waves, that was a 1-to-1 question type. So what does that mean? That means that the pre-test, the information in the game, and the post-test all contain the same exact information. So it's about very short-term retention measurement, but it's just to show proof of concept. That last wave we did here on category management at NPS is derivative question types, which is the pre-test and post-test mirror each other. The bomb information in the video game, the types of information in there would help you derive the right answer, right? So that's helpful. The other thing is we saw a lot better results on the gaming group here at NPS because we had better hardware, better lab environments than the students that we tested the other waves on down at a tech school in Texas. So it's just something that we picked up on, that the environment, hardware, all these attributes really matter. And if you have questions about that or are interested in gaming research or game design, let me know. I'd love to answer questions related to that. In terms of the player experience, so we asked people to rate, on a 1 to 10 scale, how much they would recommend this experience. So, if you fall within a certain band, you're considered a detractor. If you fall above a certain band, you're considered a promoter, and everyone else is passive. And what we saw is with the gaming group, it's very closely associated to the control group, but you did have a little bit more distinction where it's like you either don't like it or you do like it. And that's something that the gaming literature will show too, which is that forcing people to play a game who don't want to play a game is actually worse than you might expect. So that can have a really negative outcome. It's also really important to understand the types of games people play and like. And there's a lot of evidence that we need to do a massive defense acquisition study into gamer types and the different types of attributes that gamers within our community would prefer to get the most bang for our buck as we develop this type of curriculum and modality of learning. And we are pushing forward with our ARC folks and the DoD to try to make that investment in that research project. And then, students who played the game said that they would be more likely to do this outside of class. Now, this is on a single study. I can tell you that we also have taken our video game to a couple of professional conferences at NCMA and with the Air Force, and we get wonderful feedback of folks saying like, hey, we want to compete between groups. And so there's a lot of excitement around that. And so I think anytime you can get excitement around learning contract and acquisition, you can see that there's a benefit there. Where are we going? What are we thinking about? Well, as we talk about those game types and those gamer types, we're looking at here with this little matrix we've created, which is there's sort of these game types and these subjects within acquisition. And we're trying to map what types of games we think would be best suited for teaching that sort of lesson. And if you see an X on this chart, that means that either us or someone else is working in this space. So obviously the category management and mandatory sources of supply, we've done as a first-person shooter. That's been built, we've tried it out, we still have it available. We are working small proof of concept projects with NC State on escape rooms related to market intelligence or protest risk. Arcade games like pinball, pachinko, endless runner games. On the other side of what we're trying to do at Silas is also just running simulations. So we have studies here looking at how do we simulate contractor offer evaluations to extract what people really prefer in a trade-off versus just asking them a priori, what do you like best? And then we'll put that as your relative ranking in your trade-off, which our studies have shown, and we're going to keep looking, but I expect to see that people are really bad at a priori determining their order of preference for certain things. So when you talk about price and non-price factors, most of the time people will say price isn't as important as it really is. And then they will pick on certain non-price attributes as being more important than they really are when price is a factor. So all of that is some of the things we're looking at. We're using just simple commercial software to prove out those simulations, but that's going on here as well. And then we're also looking at how we can do really interesting things like build tower defense games to teach contingency contracting and stuff like that. So, again, the biggest lesson for us is that there's 3 lines of effort in these studies: game design, curriculum design, research design. You really shouldn't divorce those if you can keep from doing that. On the research side of the house, maybe the game design we could use, like I said, bring in some commercial stuff. But the other pieces is where we really see our niche area as being able to help with the curriculum and study design and merge that to the game elements. So we're doing a lot of really cool stuff, interesting things. If you have questions about that and other ideas of what gaming can be used for, please reach out. And turn it over to you, General Thurgood. Thanks for the time.
Hey, Dan, thanks. Great job. Really interesting work on the research associated with gaming and how gaming can be used to teach and learn. And I think right here, as we transition our nation into ability to work from home and do school work from home and learn from home, those skill sets and that research is really important to us in a broad sense as we move forward. So thanks, Dan, for that great work. Carly, you're up next. We'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity here, and I'm really proud to brief you on a recent success story. It actually has some pretty interesting intersections, I think, with our previous briefer and several of the others. So once again, I'm Carly Jackson. I'm here from the Naval Information Warfare Systems Command, headquartered out here in sunny San Diego. And the topic that I have for you today is about new methods to accelerate acquisition. We have used the power of digital platforms recently to accelerate the adoption of emerging technologies and innovations into fleet architectures. What you see here on this first slide is a summary of our first all-digital advanced naval technology exercise. Advanced Naval Technology Exercises, or ANTEXs, is a framework that has been used for the better part of a decade by the Naval Warfare Centers, which is an STRL innovation lab that was mentioned earlier as one of the innovation mechanisms. In previous iterations of these Advanced Naval Technology Exercises, or ANTEXs, they have been very focused on getting technology out of the lab, off of the benches, and into the field. And in many cases, these forums provided a very low barrier of entry for technologies to get into the field, many for the first time. Another key element of the Advanced Naval Technology Exercises is the partnership, right? It was about lowering the barrier of entry for scientists, but not only our naval civilian scientists, but opening the doors to our defense industrial partners, commercial entrants that may or may not have done work with the DoD before, academia organizations, and then to provide the venue for DoD decision makers, for our acquisition community, for the key decision makers that are making decisions about future technologies and what to insert into their next iterations. It also provided a key coordinating function with the operating forces you see at the very bottom here of this slide. In many cases, it was the first time that uniformed personnel were able to get their hands on technology, use it in quasi-operationally relevant setting, most of the time looking over the shoulder of an engineer that was operating the tech, whether it was a drone, a new software application, a new sensor, or other.
Hey, Carla, just sorry to interrupt you. Are you presenting the slides? We can't see them if you're not sharing them.
Ah, okay.
I apologize.
No, I'm glad you interrupted, sir. Let's see. Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so what I just kind of spoke through at the very just now was what is shown on the left-hand side, is that we are about delivering capability and creating a forum for all of the stakeholder groups that are shown there in the white bubbles. What we did with this particular all digital event, you can imagine we took it into the gaming environment. Because Project Overmatch, which is the Navy's contribution to the Joint All-Domain Command and Control Objective, is about delivering the architecture, the communications and command and control architecture that's critical to providing decision advantage. That is the mission. Part of the objective is about delivering the NOAA, what we call the NOAA, but it's also secondarily about changing the way that we go about delivering capability. And that speaks to the objectives of this conference, which is the means and methods to break down barriers, try new things, and accelerate the way that the speed at which we deliver capability at the pace that's required to maintain overmatch over, a very technologically savvy adversary. So what we did is that we provided this simulation-based environment. We called them iRILs, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in the future, but you see the graphic there on the right with the uniformed person that's totally immersed in the architecture, and we're able to play these technologies at the component level and see their outcomes very, very, very quickly and at paces that frankly surprised ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, I want to confirm that my slide moved, slide 4. Okay, so how did we do that? Our approach were these integrated rapid innovation labs, iRILs. They're effectively sandboxes. As much as we could, they were GOTS based, and the reason for that is that we had to meet the operational architecture that is in the fleet today with a certain level of abstraction. So GOTS based, something that we can modify with our government scientists and engineers fairly quickly, easily integrated with models and technologies that can come to us from almost anywhere. That's a key. It's easier said than done, but being able to set up the environment to very quickly integrate technologies into these environments for assessment. We also had some criteria about making sure that those individual sandboxes that were provided to the developers could very easily be federated with mission simulators, such that we could quickly assess the mission outcome and the effect that those technologies had on mission criteria. It allowed us to trade fidelity for scalability fairly quickly. Again, lower fidelity type models that could very quickly be scaled up into operationally relevant models within our classified spaces, but first allow that low barrier of entry to our industry partners. We enabled the rapid prototyping and evaluation of emerging protocols and architectures. In this particular case, it was focused pretty finely on communication routing protocols and the several hundred lines of codes only that's responsible for that, and very quickly depended on a pipeline set of training quality data sets in order to fully evaluate all of those capabilities that we were looking at. So in terms of overarching objectives, you see there the green check mark. First objective was to provide a two-way communication path to inform our partners' research and development efforts, and we did that. The second objective that was met was really to also identify those technologies that were going to make a difference, that are going to make a difference in those fleet architectures very, very, very quickly. Some of the graphics you see on the right are how we went about doing that. Part of that iRIL also included a front end that was able to rapidly provide our participants feedback, whether their performance was better or worse, and they were able to rapidly innovate within the period of weeks once their technology was integrated into the dashboard. Upper right, you see the Sigma dashboard, which shows an excerpt from that mission analysis that I was talking about. What's the impact on the mission? Were you able to close the kill chain, and were they able to close the link? And that's what some of our operational users were able to assess the technology against. Some graphics from some shots from the actual presentation and selection day, where we've got some senior leaders and technologists interfacing with the industry participants as well. So in terms of timeline of how this was achieved, we used the Prize Challenge Authority in order to generate interest in this. That was released in about the June timeframe, and then a very rapid series of events that brought us to 16 white papers being evaluated, with an invitation to 6 finalists to actually take their routing protocols, put it in the iRIL, and allow for that assessment to happen. We saw a very wide variety of technical approaches from our industry participants. They span from very traditional Manet approaches all the way to deep learning inspired techniques from some of our more academically inclined organizations. We did identify a first and a second place winner, and they were given some cash awards there. In the case of our first place winner, it was a small business that had fairly low exposure to defense applications prior to participating in this event. And so it was a really energizing opportunity. But more importantly, on the back end of the event, the outcome for them, the most significant outcome was really not winning the cash award. It was about that two-way conversation that we were able to establish at a deep, meaningful technical level in order to really inform them of what our problem set was, and how they would help, how they could better help us go and assess it. All of the companies, whether they won or not, were very inspired, and we are continuing collaborations with them moving forward, both with their own internal R&D investments and also looking for other mechanisms in order to fund efforts directly as we move forward. So all in all, about a 6-month effort to go from not knowing what we don't know about what's out there in commercial and academic enterprises and technologies, to being able to assess some technologies in a very meaningful way within 6 months' time. In terms of the outlook for future engagements, we do have an intention to create a recurring series of these type of events to support the objectives of this priority naval program. You can see a comparison on the left there from sort of the old model of taking things into the field, assessing technologies at the system level, meaning a UAV. We could be assessing an entire software system, as opposed to what we were able to do with the iRILs, which is to now assess the technology at a container level, at a software container level, at a subset or subsystem level, which really facilitates tech transition at much higher speeds. So the blue line kind of shows the original model that I personally was involved with, and it does serve a purpose. But what we found during those events is that post-event, it's still required many months, in many cases multi-years, in order to complete development and integration into the fleet architecture, because we were starting from scratch effectively. So many of those systems their communication systems had to be ruggedized, their interfaces had to be changed, their engines in some cases had to be swapped out for logistics reasons, as was discussed during the press brief. And that took several months to years in many cases before we could get to a fleet fielding. What we're seeing now with this new model, when we have high confidence in what the fleet architecture is and what the gap, what the technology area and that container, where that container will transition into, we can really shorten those times. And if it's software, we can transition at ridiculous speeds. So much faster, much more iterative cycles from these advanced naval technology exercises into fieldings. And then on the right-hand side, you just see a global view of, we're all, the intent here is this two-way, double-sided arrow conversation where we can reach into investments from the very broad spans of the defense industrial base, and then very quickly promote technologies from these low barrier of entry type events into higher fidelity events, and then prioritize them for actual insertion into the fleet architectures. So we learned a lot from this process, surprised ourselves, and are looking at, we have codified our recommendations and are working toward a path forward for the specific technologies that were identified during the event itself, whether they were these specific networking routing protocols or AI tools. Continuing to work the maturation of those technologies into our live, virtual, and constructive environments, which is just a higher fidelity way to experiment and train the fleet on how to use these innovations. The fourth bullet there talks about, well, what's next, right? We built 2 iRILs effectively for this event, but they're fairly focused in their technology sphere as necessary in order to create that assessment. But we know there are more, and so we're creating the framework to go out and determine what is the next right technology area to focus on and engagement to have with industry, and then codifying that all into an overarching acquisition strategy to accelerate the fleet adoption of science and technological innovations. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Carly. Really interesting how you reach out to small companies in particular. Fascinating. We find it fascinating that some of these small companies almost have no idea how to work with the government. So it's an education on both sides, I think. So really great, interesting work. Okay, our last panel member will be Brian. Again, Brian, some great work. We'll turn it over to you.
There we are. Hello, everybody. I wish Lieutenant Williams could be here today. This is her labor of love, but she is out doing the mission, couldn't break away, so I am the player to be named later. I worked with Catherine Ayton, a colleague here at MPS, to advise this project. Elena was interested in whether and how 3D printing might be able to help in pretty high velocity medical logistics environments. And so we'll talk about what she discovered here. So unsurprising to probably everybody, mass casualty events are challenging environments. Some of the challenge, though, might be not as obvious because it comes back to affect logistics and medical logistics, and how that consequences of those challenges to medical logistics can end up affecting patient care and potentially even lives, because they drive the medical practitioners to need to use workarounds because they don't have the correct supplies in the correct quantities when they need them. And we'll talk about that. So the research questions: does 3D printing have a role? And if so, where? And we focused our study on basically consumable medical supplies, syringes, tubes, things like that, things that you need in quantity, things that you probably need more often than not. But again, we wanted to focus on some specific areas for this preliminary study. How do we do it? Well, thankfully, Lieutenant Williams was embedded in a unit that had a worldwide headline news mass casualty event, and in fact, a couple of them. And so she knew all the players and had kept contemporaneous logs for her turnover manuals when, at that deployed site. So the first part of the study was we did case analyses of some of these mass casualty events to identify the critical incidents and the process failure points. Where did things break down in terms of medical supplies? We did that through interviewing all the people that have been deployed with her. And again, by being able to access contemporaneous logs, including inventory levels, problems to fix for the future, all that kind of information. With that in hand, having identified where the problems were, we then went to experts on medical 3D printing, and we asked them which of the critical problem areas did they think 3D printing could help with, and why or why not. We integrated those to kind of create a set of marching orders, really, for how we might best employ 3D printing toward the goal of improving medical logistics in these demanding areas. So let's talk about this for a minute. What are the problems? Well, mass casualty events are inherently, they're uncertain, they're erratic. You don't know when they'll happen. You don't know how big they'll be. You don't know how many people will be hurt. You don't know what kinds of injuries you'll face. I mean, you can have some general ideas, but you won't know till the people start rolling in. Because you don't know when or how much, stocking for these events becomes tricky. And that gets compounded because we can't use typical inventory models to stock our supplies. Well, why can't we do that? It turns out we allow doctors to, as they rotate in, to order preferred inventory items in lieu of others. Now, there may be very similar items, and you've all probably had the experience of going to a doctor and one had been prescribing medicine X, and then maybe you have to switch doctors and they say, well, I totally understand why you're taking medicine X, but I'd like you to try the equivalent drug by somebody else because they just have more experience with it. Or maybe they have, some particular nuanced opinion, but we allow this, and now in a deployed environment, this happens every 6 to 12 months, which leads to complications because now old inventory that didn't get used because we didn't have any mass casualty events is taking up limited storage space, and we can't put the new stuff in. And so all of this creates problems, but then there's further problems. Patients show up, they're badly hurt. This is a mass casualty event in a deployed operating environment. So we're talking about combat casualties, perhaps. And if the people have to stay any longer than we are stocked and targeted by policy to plan for, well, now the people stay around longer, using up more of our limited supplies. So that creates a drain on supplies. And then finally, restocking becomes problematic because, number one, we have to order to resupply from what are called prime vendors that are purely stateside in the continental US. The depots are in certain key locations, but certainly for the case of this study, which was in Afghanistan, the depots were in Europe. Well, all that can be fine, except, again, by policy, if there's active combat in an area, I can't fly a plane in. So I literally cannot resupply if there are adversaries in the area shooting. So I might be using up all my supplies because more injured people than we planned for. They might not be able to leave my facility because there's adversaries in the area, so they have to stay longer, and I can't bring in new supplies. And these are some of the critical events on the slide. These are some of the specific examples that illustrate all these points. But essentially, we have both a capacity problem and a demand problem. Amplifying the capacity problem, I should mention, here at almost any major medical center worldwide, they can close to new patients. If they are full with enough challenging patients, they can say, we can't adequately care for new patients, and you'll have to redirect to another hospital. Not so easy to do in a combat zone, right? You are the option. Patients have to come to you. So you have both capacity challenges and demand challenges coming to play, and they create risk for patients. So what do we do? Well, we looked at this, and I know this is an eye chart. Totally understand it's an eye chart. The idea here is we found really kind of 4 significant factors that cause problems: time, distance, the mass casualty criteria themselves, and space. And I've kind of talked through some of these, but the idea of time is if a patient stays longer, they're using more of my limited supplies than I planned for. And there's lots of details in the slide you can look at, but same with distance. The further away my resupply is or other medical facilities are, makes it harder to get supplies in and to evacuate wounded people that might be no longer needing trauma care. We've sort of patched them up and they can go to a rehab hospital somewhere else. But if I have to keep them in my trauma center, they're taking up bed space and using supplies. And then we talked through mass casualty and then space constraints. It's a limited number of beds, limited number of supplies. And when we run out, we have problems. So we mapped out some problem areas and we took 6 key items that showed up over and over in these instances that we looked at. Syringes, IV tubes, cranial kits, which allow you to drain pressure for brain injuries, implant devices, suction valves, suction canisters. These are things that are used over and over. They're consumable medical supplies. And we asked experts in medical 3D printing, for example, from the US, healthcare school and so on. We asked them which of these items had the most and the least potential for 3D printing and why. And as you can see, some came in low, most were moderate, one was high. So the high potential, the implants, they're high potential because they're being done. We do this. We 3D print implantable devices of various kinds that we can use in medicine, and they have approval, FDA approval, and so on. So those can be done. The challenge we discovered is they require relatively large 3D printers. Let me pivot to the low potential ones, and then we'll come back to the middle. The low potential ones, well, for one thing, cranial kits, they aren't being looked at. Nobody's looked into whether we can 3D print them. So we have no experience. So the experts said, well, they're not high on the list of things. IV tubing, well, you'd think that might be pretty straightforward, but the problems there are plastic might have the potential to what is called leach. The body fluids can leach through the plastic tubing and vice versa. Medications and anything else in the tubing can leach back and forth. And so that creates problems for FDA approval for use in medical environments. Syringes, well, another slam dunk, except it turns out nobody has solved the challenge of how to 3D print the rubber stopper in a syringe. That is an unsolved problem right now. So while the rest of it can play, they rated it as a sort of a moderate potential because we still need to solve that one problem. Suction valves, suction canisters, same kind of thing. There's been some work done. We're not totally there yet, but the idea here was to try to say, okay, of 6 things we found that we continued to run into problems with, they got used up fast, and without them, we ran into problems. For example, the syringes, people were having to reuse, which if anybody has, can spell the word medicine, if I give you enough, hints, reusing that sounds pretty inappropriate, pretty bad, and it is. But what are the options? What are the alternatives? And so we looked at these devices that should be relatively straightforward, found out in some cases they are, in some cases not so much. So what do we conclude? Well, the good news is, 3D printing does have the potential. Some items are more amenable to it than others today, as I talk to you. And we sort of prioritized some of them in terms of which ones are most easily addressed right now with current technology, current FDA approvals, and so on. We identified the limitations that ranked some of the candidate items as lower. Things like the leaching, water tightness, the rubber stopper that we just can't seem to solve yet. We also found another interesting sort of conclusion, and that's the cool thing about doing this kind of study is you look at one thing and you might find something else that's really interesting. Because we were looking at the problem of solving the supply shortages that come up when mass casualties occur. Well, what we found from the experts is maybe the best thing to print is antibiotic bandages because they can be applied in the field and they might be able to prevent patients from being as bad when they show up at the hospital and use fewer supplies. Medical repairs are another big area. Recommendations, I'll get off the stage. The biggest thing is we actually should probably, this is a simple one. We can make a better decision about how long to stock to. The policy right now is you stock to 72 hours. Let's stock to 96. That alone gives us a buffer. Small printers, let's try them out in the field and see if it works. And then for future study, encouraging more conversation between medical logisticians and the researchers to help prioritize where the problems are and how we might discover these workarounds, like the antibiotic bandages, is a future direction we can go. General, back over to you.
All right, thanks. That really super interesting. I think having been on many of the battlefields of our nation over the last 30 plus years, that ability to move medical supplies forward and maybe create them forward is really interesting work. So if I could get all the panelists to turn your cameras back on, I think we'll go into some questions. And I'll start. I think we've heard a theme, which is an innovative approach to many things. So some of it's acquisition, some of it's medical supplies, some of it's logistics supplies, how to reach out to small companies, really a lot of innovative work. And so I'll start with Jennifer on a question of innovation. And it's really two parts, kind of combining two ideas. Number one is most of us are requirements based and we make our decisions based on those requirements. And sometimes we're not very innovative as we approach those requirements. And then at the same time, we want the requirement, we also want it really fast. And sometimes those two things aren't compatible. So Jennifer, from your research, how do you balance a known needed requirement with innovation, and how does time affect that innovation? Over.
Yeah, thank you, sir. This is something that we've discussed a few different ways and a few different, for many years, trying to figure out how to crack that nut, right? The distinction between urgency and speed and innovation. And I think what I have to offer isn't particularly revolutionary, but might be helpful, is that there is a right place and a right time for all functions, and the bureaucracy, I think, needs to adapt a bit more to be able to accommodate more freedom where that's appropriate. So we need to actually think through all of the decision-making processes and the stops along the way. What does that look like? I think we've had that conversation. We're starting to get it. We have the rapid acquisition offices. We're looking at different ways in which we can modify our whole systems with a mid-tier acquisition. And I think this is all sort of getting after that same question, and we're just need to keep continuing down the pathway of it and accommodating as many of these and keep the conversation going. Related to, again, as I term it, the bureaucratic attributes that need to be accounted for, and then those innovation environment attributes that should also be accounted for. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. And Dan, if you could kind of continue with that theme on the innovation and the speed of innovation in which the gaming industry has been able to accelerate, and how we've been able to take advantage of that acceleration in our teaching. Over.
Yes, sir. Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot of correlation between what Jennifer's talking about and like what we're actually seeing, right? So it's, again, we talk about constraints and opportunities, right? And how has the gaming world been able to say, like, let's take the shackles off and let you pretend like for a moment that all those constraints don't exist, or we'll inject constraints in random elements. It kind of gets to Brian's point, right? Like he's talking about these supply chain issues where it's like, we don't know when this is going to happen. We can't prepare for that. It's like, well, you could randomly prepare for what ifs, and that can be done through games and simulation. Now, you won't always get it right, but you'll probably have a better playbook than if you only imagine the threat you've always experienced, right? And I think that's what gaming and simulation can really assist with.
Okay. And I think it's interesting, right? I think most of us in our professions, in our research, and our lives would, we may not get it right all the time, but what we don't want to do is totally miss, right? We may not get it perfect, but we don't want to strike out, because that'll be at the peril of our warfighters that are deployed forward. So I appreciate that. Carly, in your world where you've reached out with these innovative ideas, when you look at the government and how we innovate, how would you compare and contrast how a small business might innovate compared to how we might innovate? Over.
Sure. So I do think that the answer to that question is it depends. And it depends quite a bit on how the government acquisition, the target program that we're talking about that is on the receiving end of transition. And there's such diversity in acquisition strategies and technical architecture approaches across the board that it's what we have learned really should be passed on to many of those programs that are receiving it. And I guess what I mean by that is that one of the critical enablers that we found that was so enabling to these small businesses was that if the architecture was truly open, going back to one of our principles from, the 80s, right? Modular open systems architecture. But if our system is truly open to the point where a third-party developer can, in the matter of weeks, develop a container, integrate it into the relevant architecture, and be ready to field, the real thing, not a simulation, that's a huge enabler. And it speaks, what it requires of the program that's on the receiving end of that is pretty significant. And as we look forward to what areas that we're looking at, it's not just about technical priority, but it really depends on those target programs and whether they're open enough, much less whether they have the contracting and the funding and the requirements and infrastructure to support it. So it's a big challenge, and but we have shown it can be done, and so that's what's really inspiring about this.
Yeah, thanks. That last idea I think is really interesting, right? We often talk about the valley of death from a technical perspective, but there's a requirements valley of death, a money valley of death, and then there's an acceptance valley of death, right? And when all those four are lined up, it works really good. And when they don't, then one of those valleys doesn't get filled in, it causes problems. So, so Brian, from your perspective, given that the medical community is relatively regulated compared to other communities, and we're trying to innovate, you talked about the antibiotic bandages, I think are just phenomenal. What do you think, from what you've learned, is the next step in the process when it comes to driving innovation in a community which is relatively regulated? Over.
Right. What I did like from this study was, number one, that depending on some other constraints, we do really have the decision to just make the opportunity to just make a different decision. Part of our problem is we're constrained by, we assume patients will be with us 72 hours in this setting. And so it's really not necessarily an innovation. It's just make a different decision that, I can create a 33% buffer just by saying, go to 96 hours. But I think the next direction is opening that aperture. As we discovered with the antibiotic Band-Aid, that is totally outside the scope of what we looked at. We were looking at fixing the problem internal to the box, the medical facility. The solution is outside the box, right? It's somewhere else. It is by attacking the problem in the golden hour of trauma out there on the field. That scratches a whole bunch of potential internal itches. I think the final thing is getting the experts in the supply and logistics arena talking more with the medical personnel, so we can figure out where these challenges lie and discover these external solutions like the bandages. Over.
Okay, so So given that, a question popped up, which was the next question I was going to ask, which is super. So from your four perspectives, maybe in 1 minute or less for each of you, we'll start back at the top with Ms. Jennifer. We have this innovation idea, and we know we need to do it. And sometimes industry doesn't know how to get to us. Number one part of the question. And part two of the question is, what is the one thing that you think we can do to help open up the aperture of the bureaucracy that we're all part of to innovation? So how does small business do that? And then what's the one thing from your research you take away, go, if we could solve this, we'd open the aperture of our thinking in the rule sets we play by. Ms. Jennifer, we'll start with you. We got about 4 minutes.
Sure. Just to be real quick, I think the starting point is what they're already doing, and sometimes with the innovation steering group and creating that central node. One of the things that the Defense Innovation Board, of course, has looked at is whether or not you have a chief innovation officer who can act as sort of a flight, the words aren't coming to me, but you know what I mean, the air traffic controller who can actually direct people to the right place at the right time. I think that'll all kind of operate in service of it. And I personally would like to see some sort of centralization of functions like I described, whether it's that hiring, acquisition, get the performance metrics right for innovation in a way that sort of is both of the institution and separate from the institution in order to actually further some of our innovation practices. So that's what I might come down on that front.
All right, super. That's really, really good advice. Okay. Dan, from your foxhole?
Yes, sir. So I may not have the traditional answer that most people are thinking about in this space. So for me, there's this old paper from Granovetter, which is called The Power of Weak Ties. Super important, the concept that, like, sitting in your foxhole with people that sit on the same concentric circle that you do, you can all sit around and innovate together and everything's going to look very much the same, right? Being more open, right? So that gets at being engaged with the market more. Market intelligence needs to be improved across the board. But we also have to realize something too, right? As we increase our ability, which we have been doing, to reach out to these small businesses, we're going to have more things fall in the valley of death. That's just natural, especially as we create this spray and pray. We probably could get away from that, right? Which is, are we making sure that real requirements are getting communicated to people? And are we giving these people that are interacting with these small businesses too much autonomy, not autonomy, but I guess false authority, which is like, hey, you kind of need to tell them that phase one is really important. And if you don't get that customer discovery and get your requirements right and know that it's enterprise level, that you can actually, scale this, then we shouldn't sell it to them or anyone else like it's actually going to make it. So I think that's a little bit of messaging. And just understand that as we open the market the way we have, we're going to increase the noise. So you're going to hear from industry, you're not working well, this isn't going well, I didn't win. So the more people we touch, the more we're going to hear it. That's just a natural. So we need to be, I think, cognizant of that. We need to react to it, but we also don't need to freak out and be like, oh my God, more people than ever are complaining. It's like, well, we're talking to more people than ever. That's a natural way it's going to work. So my position.
All right, thanks. Yeah, good point. More shots on goal, the more you miss, right? Like that, kind of like hockey. So Carly, a minute or so.
Sure. I'll have maybe a more typical answer, but it's one that really, frankly, needs to be addressed, and I think it's the one that is has shown the most blocker when it comes to transitioning things, and it really just comes down to fiscal flexibility. I think over the years of all of this accelerated acquisition and innovation-minded standing up new authorities and new organizations and experimenting with new ways to go about doing it, we've shown we can address many of the other pitfalls relatively well. We have the authority and everything. In my experience, the challenge always comes back to having the flexible funding lines that are available to support the various handoffs across that valley of death. And that speaks not only to, there are some actions that DoD can take in order to do that, but it also really, really requires a different discussion and a different level of trust with the Hill in order to support us and trust us in order to be able to make those decisions within execution year and within a FIDIP at the speed of the threat. So.
Yeah. Okay. Brian, we're going to give you a bye on that. We're going to lose our link here in about
You saw me pointing. I was going with Fink's strength of weak ties anyway, so I cede my time, sir.
All right, super. Thanks. Listen, for the panel members, just really outstanding work. Very interesting research. This idea of innovation is critical for us. So to the team, thank you. To NPS, thank you for hosting this great event today. And we appreciate those who joined us. Thank you very much. Over.